life to make you want to scream, what's up? So much time and energy allegedly elapsed and wasted. So many brain cells ab or unused. So many lovers ill or unfused. So much fuss about what's old and what's new. And who's who. And ultimately what to do about you or I. So I saw a sorcerer set sail and soar in a saucer for flying spies for unauthorized explanation.
Good evening, I'm Jeff Levin, and this is How to Choose a Psychotherapist. Each week, we'll explore a distinctive approach to psychotherapy with an expert in the field. Tonight's very special guest is Golda Michelson. Golda has been a therapist for the last 14 years. As a licensed marriage, family, and child therapist, she has a private practice in San Francisco and San Anselmo. She has been the president of the Bioenergetic Society of Northern California from March 1985 through March 1991. She also supervises graduate students at the California Institute for Integral Studies and works as a clinician for the Marin Day Treatment Program serving severely emotionally disturbed children. And it's my special pleasure to welcome and introduce Golda Michelson. Good evening.
Good evening.
As a bioenergetics therapist, I'd like, if you could, to tell what is bioenergetics therapy?
Well, bioenergetics is based on the belief that the mind and the body is the same. And it also is based on the idea that we develop chronic tension or muscle holding as a way to repress strong feelings and impulses.
How do we get to repress through muscle holding? What happens that we do that?
There may be many circumstances where we would experience a similar feeling, and we might tense our muscles in that particular way as a means of protection, and it would happen so often that there would be chronic holding.
How do people get into these habits?
Through experiences in their family where there may be experiences where they're not always able to protest or say exactly how they feel because it just may not be safe for them.
So you're alluding to early childhood kinds of events that as small children we've just gotten into a habit of holding ourselves? Right.
In some ways, in order to survive our families, we've had to make a lot of compromises because it just wasn't safe for us to be as open as we originally started out to be. And in times when we were really open, there were situations where, as a result of that experiences, we tensed and we held, and we've had to compromise ourselves in many ways. And with those compromises, we've developed, body tension.
How was this kind of therapy developed?
It was developed by Alexander Lowen and John Prokis, and they set up the Institute for Bioenergetic Analysis in 1956. And how Alexander Lowen and Prokis got started was they were students of Wilhelm Reich. And just to give you a little historical background, Reich was also a student of Freud. So it's very steeped in traditional psychoanalytical theory.
And how do we go from that analytical thinking theory to a body-oriented psychotherapy?
Well, Lowen developed it as a result of his experiences with Reich. And he was in therapy with Reich and then felt like there were some things that weren't addressed and went on, he and Prokis, to develop some of their own, adding to the theory. But it's very much based on Reichian work.
And in coming out of this analytic theory, we're still looking at a model of therapy which has a lot to say about human development.
Human development and psychoanalytic theory, and in combination with really looking at the body and addressing the relationship between the body and the mind.
As a bioenergetics therapist, when someone calls for therapy, how would you distinguish that this is a person who would be a good candidate to do energetic work as opposed to traditional analytical work?
Well, some people call me and know that I do bioenergetics. And sometimes with other people, I will introduce the concept and the belief to them, and if that's something that they're open to, it may be something that we would pursue. Otherwise, I would do more traditional talking therapy with them.
And if a person came and didn't know that you had this expertise and just sat down and had a relationship with you in therapy, are you, as the therapist, always looking for these kind of holdings, the muscular, physical holdings in a person?
Definitely. I would use that as diagnostic. I would use it within the session. Even if we're not doing body work, I might ask a person to breathe into their chest or to relax their jaw, or I would notice when they're not breathing and encourage them to talk or breathe at that point.
So you might be doing a subtle form of bioenergetic therapy, even if you're not calling it that.
Exactly, exactly. A focus and an orientation on the body and watching the body.
Can you tell us what it would be like to be in a full-fledged body-oriented therapy compared to the traditional sitting in the chair therapy?
Okay. Well, there really isn't a typical session, but a session where there's some body work, I may encourage that person to take a postural stance. I may encourage that person to move in a certain way. And I may encourage that person to really breathe in different parts of their body, and I would focus in the areas where the most tension is being held.
When you say breathe in different parts of their body, do we breathe other places than our lungs?
Well, I might encourage the person to breathe into their chest and also into their belly. And sometimes people breathe very, very minimally, and the belief is that to the extent that we inhibit our breathing is to the extent that we inhibit our feelings.
So that's one of the keys for you diagnostically, is what you're saying, that a person who's breathing very limited breath and very shallow breathing may do better to work bioenergetically than just talking about things?
Right. It could really help that person get in touch with who they are and their feelings, and to help them to reclaim their body if they're really cut off from their body.
But when you say that we've been holding back from feeling some of these feelings, it might be very uncomfortable to feel those feelings that have been repressed.
That's right, it may. And what I hope that every therapist tries to set up is a really safe place for that person to express those feelings. And this may be an opportunity for that person to express a lot of feelings that they have never been able to, because it wasn't safe for them to protest, or it wasn't safe for them to express those feelings in their family.
And what I'm imagining is that you're giving people a kind of an exercise. You're directing them through movement or expression that reclaims the right to say how they're feeling.
Exactly. That's really encouraged, and it's also really encouraged for a person to give voice to their feelings and to make noises and to let out their voice.
Is that difficult for people?
Very difficult. There's a lot of inhibition, a lot of feeling shy. Just it's very difficult for people to really let themselves feel and to express their feelings.
How do you help someone who maybe an example of helping somebody who really isn't feeling comfortable about letting out a large sound, and that you think maybe that's a good idea?
Well, I would start out with a very small sound, and I would also talk with them about their fears around letting out their voice and exploring it in an analytical way, but to start out making a small voice, small noise, and increasing it, and helping them to see that it's really okay to do that.
So you're not really pushing them beyond their comfort level?
Right. I like to really respect where a person is, and to kind of stay and meet them energetically. And so if they can go a little further, and my sensing that, to push them in that way, but if there's any resistance, is to, you know, back off, to
You
really
seem-
follow them.
Hmm. You seem to be, in fact, you just said the word, follow them. You seem to be engaging them in a dance.
Exactly, exactly, and to watch where they're moving and how they're moving, what they can tolerate, what they can't.
And is this a different length of treatment, a different hour than the 50-minute hour that so many therapists keep?
No, it's basically the same 50 minutes.
And you can do all this dancing and come to some conclusion?
That's the hope.
Uh-huh.
Not all sessions are, you know, everything is all packaged really nice. It may be that they're beginning to open up and exploring an area. And in every session, the hope is not only to open a person up, but also to contain them. It's not only expressing their feelings, but some people have trouble around containment. So that would be what you would work with them rather than expressing. Some people who are too impulsive, you would work with them around containment issues and holding the energy and feeling okay about holding the feeling without having to discharge it or let it go in some way. So with different people and different body types, you would work in some ways differently.
Well, I know that you work with the Marin treatment program with seriously emotionally disturbed children, and when you talk about containment, I think that's probably why a lot of those children are referred to that kind of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you would actually work in a bioenergetic mode even with children.
I have in the past, because some of the exercises the kids find really fun. With some kids who have a lot of trouble with expressing their anger, or they're impulsive with their anger and they fly off the handle, I've encouraged them in my office to do some hitting and to throwing a ball against a door and expressing their anger, so that it's a safe, contained way for them to express their anger. And the hopes is that if they can do some of that in my office, then maybe they won't have to do as much in the classroom or at home.
So they can learn to be a little more effective in their expression and not get into trouble.
Right.
You work primarily, though, with adults in your private practice?
Doing bioenergetics. I also see a lot of children where I do play therapy.
What kind of people do the best? You know, who would be a prime candidate to do some bioenergetics work?
I think most people could benefit from it. I think it's particularly helpful for people who are very cognizant of the fact that they stay in their head and they're very, you know, tight in their body, and that they know, very aware that there's a lot of feeling there, but they're not able to, with their own resources, get in touch with it. I think it can also be really helpful for people, for whatever reasons, have had to disown their body. A lot of women who've been molested have needed to disown their body, and it would be a way for them to re-experience their body and be in touch with their body and their feelings.
What do you mean by disown their body?
I think for some people, based on their early experiences, they've had to leave their body in some way and not feel what was going on because it was so painful, and in some ways disown their body.
To have an experience of being outside of their body, just in their head? Is that what you're saying? And numb their feelings?
Numb their feeling, or have no idea whatsoever how they feel at the moment.
And again, this raises for me the fear of remembering trauma, remembering the reason that I tensed up in the first place. How can you soften that for people to make it safe enough, the container and the therapy safe enough, that I can now remember having been perhaps molested or seriously abused?
Well, I initially won't do any body work with anyone until about 4 to 6 sessions, and during this time I'm assessing whether it would make sense to do body work with that person at this time. If I feel like the level of disturbance is so great, I might choose not to do it right then, because in bioenergetics it can elicit strong feelings and memories, and sometimes people don't have the internal resources to handle that at the time. So I would use that time to assess it. And I would also, I like to go really slow with people and to really create a safe environment so that they begin to feel safe, which is another reason why I won't start off doing any body work initially.
In other words, if a person had some feelings that they may have had abuse in their childhood and were afraid to come to a therapist because all of a sudden they're going to be overwhelmed by memories, that working in this more gentle way, people might be encouraged to try therapy and not to stay bottled up with their feelings.
Right, and that to go really slow and pace the work.
I'm wondering if that's a general practice among body therapists, or perhaps there's some ways for you to give us guidelines of how do you choose a good body-oriented psychotherapist?
Well, I think I'd rather speak about addressing that. How do you find a good therapist? Because some people might choose to do body-oriented psychotherapy and some people might choose not to. And I think the issue is how do you choose a good therapist? And unless you're really wanting that particular type of therapy. But what I suggest to people is call people up, shop, and how does that person sound on the phone to them? In your interview with them, is this someone you feel like you could begin to open up with? Is this someone that you could begin this journey of exploring who you are and how you feel? So I tell people to really trust as much as they can their intuition, and also to find out if the person has training and qualifications.
In doing this work as an MFCC as opposed to doing bioenergetics work with any other license, is there a different quality difference between one person's training and another in doing energetic work?
Well, the training I had, it didn't matter what the licensing was as long as someone was already licensed, and then it was a regular training program.
So it might be an MD, a PhD,
Exactly.
a clinical social worker, and still require this additional training.
Exactly.
How many years was the program?
Most people completed it in 4 years, 4 to 5 years.
In doing this kind of training and doing this kind of work, has that changed you in any way as a therapist, as a person?
I think it's changed me. I first got involved with this in graduate school. I had to read a book, Language of the Body by Lowen. And it really made sense to me when I read it, and at that point decided to, when I got in therapy, this would be the type of therapy I would want to be in. And then later got into that type of therapy and has found that it's really helped me to know myself a lot more, really have a sense of myself and to know who I am. And it's a continual process, I feel, therapy is, and getting to know yourself and working on yourself. Doesn't stop at the end of therapy.
Does therapy stop? Is there a time when you know you're finished in a particular trial of therapy? You go and you have a certain amount of hours. How would you know if you're done?
Well, actually a client of mine asked me that today, and my answer to them was that I think it's really important to sense in yourself how you feel about 3 areas of relationships. Relationship to yourself. Are you feeling good about yourself? Relationship to your significant people in your life, your family, and your relationship to your work. Do you feel good about what you're doing? And I also said to the person, I think it also has a lot to do with how motivated a person is around self-exploration. How deep does a person want to go? And I think the third aspect of it to pay attention to is what's the feedback from your therapist. Because my experience is that sometimes people come up to a certain spot in therapy You know, they're getting all these signals. Oh my God, I better get out of here. I better get out of here. Something's about to happen. And it's at that point that they somehow feel like there's some hot spot, and it would be important for them to really work through that.
So in, again, evaluating the relationships, how is the relationship with the therapist in a bioenergetic therapy different, or is it different than the client-therapist relationship in a talking therapy?
I don't really think it's different. There's a lot of strong feelings that go on, and in the therapeutic hour that those, you know, that relationship would be explored and looked at.
Are there times in doing work, physical work with people and positioning people, that you're in on contact, your hands-on contact with people?
There are at times, and what I like to do is ask people how they feel about me touching them, and to let them know that if they feel uncomfortable in any way, they need to let me know. So I ask permission initially.
Is that something that people have resisted and have trouble with? Or?
No, not at all. I think most people want to be touched as long as it's in a safe way and clean way, direct way.
So that, again, you've already taken maybe 4 hours, maybe more, of information and relationship building before you would begin to put your hands on doing some active work together.
Right. And there are many, many sessions where I wouldn't necessarily touch the person at all. And with some people, I might choose not to touch them at all. People who've had a lot of issues around being inappropriately touched where the boundaries weren't clear. And so I am particularly in today's climate I have a lot more caution around touching people.
You mentioned today's climate. Can you elaborate?
Today's climate around that there's so many issues around abuse and sexual abuse, and I think that a lot of times people have found in their history that their own boundaries, their own bodies weren't respected. So I want to really respect that.
When you begin in terms of developing a hands-on relationship with someone, is it, if we're repairing some kind of old holding, is it ever appropriate to really hold someone, that they're getting that kind of tender touch that might turn around a previous injury, that it actually could be a very healing touch?
Yes, definitely.
Has this new environment about people being abused and so on in any way hindered the kind of work that you do, or has it sharpened your who are you willing to be physical with? Yes,
I think I'm more cautious and really watch how I touch a person, which I've always done, but just getting to know the client and who they are and what their issues are, and does it make sense to do that. Really assessing who they are.
One of the places that we have some common interests and we get to meet once in a while is with the Women's Therapy Network in San Rafael. And I know that as a member in the network, that a lot of the work that we do is answering calls from the public about finding a therapist. Do you find that people are knowledgeable about how to choose a therapist when they call you?
I think the calls that come through on the Women's Therapy Referral Network, people aren't so sophisticated about how to choose a therapist. And so I will often tell people, like what we talked about before, about really trusting how they feel. And in the Women's Referral Network, Therapy Referral Network, we often hook up people with the members of our network, and that may be based on what they're looking for. Are they looking for a man? Are they looking for a woman? It may be based on where how where they live, how far they're willing to go, what their financial situation is. There are many factors. And hopefully we make good matches.
Is there any advice that you would give to people who might be in some way considering bioenergetic work? Is there someone, for instance, who you would say shy away from this? This isn't good work for you? Or, as you were saying earlier, that maybe there are a few childhood memories or other issues that would be good to work in this way.
Yes. I think the only people I would really have shy away from is really disturbed people, people who've been diagnosed as schizophrenic, people who are psychotic, and I think it can be helpful with other people. Although with some people it might be slower than others. I may not begin to incorporate that in the work until down the line.
Anything at all about where you might send somebody, for instance, who calls and has a serious mental illness? How would they choose a therapist? Where would you send them?
I might have them call community mental health. It may also have to do with their, unfortunately, their finances, and whether they're on SSI or if they only have Medi-Cal. Then if someone's really disturbed, they probably should be seeing a psychiatrist to monitor their medication.
So when you talk about doing private practice, you work with people who can afford a therapist and who are functioning well enough in the world to be able to maintain without medications?
Yes, although I have seen people who are on medication, but it's been more antidepressants as opposed to antipsychotic medication.
Do you work differently with people who have one kind of disorder, say a depressed patient versus an anxious patient? Or is energetic work possible with both?
Energetic work is possible with both. However, with a depressed person, what I like to think of in terms of depression is that they're actually depressing their feelings. And so the work would be around helping the energy to be moved. Those people, when they're depressed, you know, they have no energy, they're tired, they have trouble moving. So the work may be around helping them to move within the therapy hour and helping their energy to get charged up. Where an anxious person, their energy sort of moving all around. So it may be free-floating. So it may be more around issues around containment. Having them hold the energy and being okay with that.
Well, you've given me a really good feeling for the kind of work that you do. And again, I'd like to thank Golda Michelson for being my special guest tonight and welcome you to tune in again. I'm your host, Jeff Levin, and this is How to Choose a Psychotherapist.
I have now reached a point where, as I've actually concluded, there exists a choice as to whether I just hate life and really love myself, or if it is life that I love and myself, which I truly can't stand. When will I learn to accept and respect time at its own pace, and at least give up this maniacal obsession with its warp, such as through means of pinched and prodded adrenals, real or simulated?